Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're heading north, way north actually, to look at how Sweden joining NATO recently is, well, changing things for the alliance's military strategy up in the Arctic, specifically thinking about cold weather operations.
It's a really interesting time. The Arctic isn't just this frozen, static place anymore. Climate change is opening up new routes, sparking more global interest, resources, but also military positioning.
Right.
So understanding how Sweden fits in with their unique Arctic background, how they mesh with NATO's strategy there, it's pretty crucial for getting a handle on the bigger geopolitical picture.
Absolutely. And to really get into this, we've looked at various materials of official reports from NATO and Sweden, academic work, analyses from different publications. Our mission today really is to figure out exactly how Sweden's capabilities, its location, are shaping NATO's Arctic approach, especially, the nitty-gritty of operating in that extreme cold. Okay, so where do we start seeing Sweden's impact?
Well, a really fundamental piece is just Sweden's strategic significance. If you look at it from a sort of power politics perspective, think about its geography. Sweden sits near the GI-UK gap, that key passage between Greenland, Iceland, the UK.
Crucial underwater route.
Exactly. And having control over those sea lanes, that significantly boosts NATO's ability to deter potential rivals, Russia, China, trying to push into the Atlantic.
So basically, NATO gets a stronger, better-placed presence in a really vital maritime zone.
Precisely. And it's not just abstract geography. Sweden brings real, tangible, Arctic-capable stuff to the table. You've got bases like Luleå and Kiruna way up north, ready to support NATO forces. Plus, their surveillance tech is pretty advanced, and that directly helps NATO monitor and maintain control up there.
Right. Real assets reinforcing NATO's footprint. And I gather Sweden's been beefing up its own defenses with the Arctic specifically in mind.
That's a key point, yeah. They've been actively modernizing new planes, new submarines, upping their defense budget. It shows a real commitment to Arctic security, especially now with more competition over resources, new shipping routes opening up.
Makes sense.
And what's interesting is this focus on the Arctic isn't brand new for them. Reports suggest they started prioritizing this back around 2017, really as a response to seeing more Russian military activity nearby. So this proactive defense of their own space now becomes a big plus for all of NATO.
It sounds like Sweden joining is as much about shifting regional power balances as it is about just collective NATO security.
Exactly right. From that power perspective, Sweden getting more involved militarily, aligning with NATO, it can be seen as a way to balance against perceived Russian assertiveness in the region. It contributes to, hopefully, a more stable environment up there.
Okay, so strategically, the location and the military gear offer clear benefits. But what about the actual doing? How does Sweden help NATO operate better in that, frankly, brutal Arctic environment?
Yeah, this is where their history really shines. Sweden has just decades upon decades of experience operating in extreme cold. They've built up this deep practical knowledge of cold weather warfare, and it's not just academic. It genuinely helps NATO tackle the huge logistical and operational problems the Arctic throws at you.
Like what sort of problems?
Well, think about equipment just failing in the extreme cold, personnel effectiveness dropping. Sweden's been working on solutions for that kind of thing for ages.
So they bring this really practical, hard-earned wisdom to the alliance. Can you give an example?
Sure. Swedish units have specific ways to maintain vehicles, so they actually work at minus 30 Celsius. Techniques maybe not standard elsewhere. Sharing that kind of know-how can cut down time for NATO forces significantly. And their specialized knowledge in Arctic logistics, setting up shelters that survive high winds, moving supplies over frozen ground that builds trust, collaboration among allies, having a partner who's proven they can handle that environment. It makes the whole alliance stronger, more cohesive, better able to respond together if needed.
Right.
And crucially, they have dedicated cold weather training centers like near Luleå and Boden. These aren't just for Swedes. NATO allies can use them to get their troops ready for Arctic conditions. That directly boosts overall readiness.
It's like having an expert guide who knows all the dangers and the best paths through really difficult terrain.
That's a great analogy. And we're already seeing Sweden jumping into NATO's Arctic drills, helping other member countries get used to the region's unique challenges. Plus, their extensive military facilities up north, high-altitude air bases, large training areas, they add another layer to NATO's ability to handle threats in the high north.
Okay, beyond people and logistics, the Arctic feels like a place where just seeing what's going on is critical. How does Sweden's surveillance tech fit into NATO's strategy?
Oh, this is a huge contribution, really valuable from both a power perspective and a cooperation angle. Sweden's been building up its own pretty sophisticated surveillance tools. Things like satellite reconnaissance, the Arctic Surveillance Initiative, for instance. It gives real-time data on ice, ship movements.
So basically providing more eyes and ears
Yeah.
in a huge, often hard-to-see area.
Exactly. They're also putting out ground radar, UAVs, drones along key Arctic routes. These are vital for tracking both military and civilian traffic, giving NATO a much clearer picture. And here's where it gets really interesting. They're using AI, artificial intelligence, in their surveillance, which gives them a strategic edge in spotting and analyzing potential threats much faster.
That sounds like a serious technological boost for the alliance.
It is. And they don't keep it to themselves. Sweden actively shares intelligence with NATO. From a realist viewpoint, that collaboration makes sense: shared interest in stability, early threat detection, and again, their location is key here.
How so?
Being so close to Russia's major military hubs, like the Kola Peninsula, well, it just makes it easier for NATO, using Swedish capabilities partly, to keep an eye on Russian movements.
So the geography isn't just about projecting power, but also about gathering vital intel.
Precisely. And their Arctic-capable drones, they offer another plus. They make NATO less reliant on fixed ground radars, which can be, vulnerable to jamming or attack. This gives NATO more flexible, resilient intelligence gathering, quicker, maybe quieter responses to any incursions.
Right.
Plus, the advanced cameras on their satellites help NATO with practical stuff too, assessing sea ice for navigation, spotting different activities, maybe missile tests, submarine movements, that sort of thing.
It really paints a picture of a comprehensive, adaptive surveillance network.
It is, and it's constantly evolving. They're working with private companies, universities too, fostering innovation, sharing expertise. Interestingly, they also share some findings on open data platforms. Shows a bit of a commitment to transparency, maybe a more collaborative security approach. And it's not all military. They use these tools for humanitarian things too, like tracking climate-related migration or ensuring maritime safety up there.
That highlights an interesting dual-use nature to their tech.
Yeah.
Okay, shifting gears a little. The Arctic is obviously environmentally super sensitive. How does Sweden's strong focus on environmental policy mesh with NATO's military goals there?
Yeah, this is a really important and sometimes tricky intersection. Sweden has a long history of pushing for strong environmental rules in the Arctic. Now, from a realist angle, you could see this strategically maybe trying to counter environmental damage by others, potentially hindering competitors that way. And by promoting sustainability, they aim to head off resource conflicts, contributing to long-term stability.
So it's partly about protecting their own long-term interests via environmental stewardship.
Partly, yeah. But they also use environmental diplomacy pretty effectively. It boosts their international image, gives them leverage, and talks about Arctic policy, makes them look like a responsible Arctic player. You see this in places like the Arctic Council, the UN. They've been leaders in things like the Arctic Environmental Protection Strategy.
So leveraging environmental leadership for diplomatic clout.
Exactly. And their focus on climate change mitigation, pushing renewables in the Arctic, advocating for emissions agreements that underlines it, they really push for binding environmental rules. Now, bringing that into NATO, Sweden actively tries to shape the alliance's Arctic strategy towards more sustainable military operations.
How does that look in practice?
Well, you see it debated in their parliament, balancing defense needs with protecting the environment. They even promote things like hybrid vehicles or renewable energy use during NATO exercises. They're genuinely trying to lessen the environmental impact of military drills.
It sounds like they're definitely pushing for a more environmentally aware approach within NATO's Arctic work.
They are. And, this brings both opportunities and some challenges as Sweden fully integrates into NATO's Arctic strategy. For instance, one challenge is just Allied troops getting used to Sweden's specialized Arctic gear. It's advanced but different. So NATO needs to adapt its training to really get the most out of these Swedish assets.
So even cutting-edge tech needs an adjustment period for allies using it.
Absolutely. But that challenge is also an opportunity, right, for better integration through joint training, share the know-how, get everyone proficient. That ultimately makes NATO stronger in the Arctic. Another interesting thing is Sweden's preference for temporary prefab infrastructure for NATO ops in sensitive Arctic areas.
Ah. trying to minimize the long-term footprint.
Exactly. It's a practical way to balance military needs with their environmental standards. But, Sweden's neutral history, their focus on peaceful, sustainable Arctic development, that can sometimes rub up against NATO's more traditional, perhaps more militaristic posture.
Leading to potential friction.
Potentially, yeah. Tensions can arise over big NATO exercises versus Sweden's green policies. We've seen reports of Sweden pushing for more renewables in drills like Arctic Challenge, maybe getting frustrated if environmental measures aren't adopted quickly by others.
So there's that balancing act between immediate military readiness and longer-term environmental concerns.
Definitely. Plus, Sweden's defense budget isn't unlimited. That could affect how much they can contribute to NATO's really large-scale deterrence efforts or big Arctic exercises. It's always about balancing national priorities with alliance commitments. And sometimes getting true whole-of-government alignment can be tricky, where Sweden's environmentally conscious strategies don't perfectly match NATO's focus on, say, offensive capabilities.
Sounds like it requires ongoing communication and mutual understanding to navigate those differences.
It really does. There's even been some internal discussion in Sweden, concerns that NATO's more assertive stance might put off other Arctic nations who prefer cooperation over alliances. That could potentially affect Sweden's role as a mediator. We've seen hints of differing operational styles too, maybe during naval ops, Sweden favoring surveillance while NATO pushes a more forward strategy. And environmental disputes during exercises like worries about heavy equipment on fragile terrain really highlight that tension between Swedish environmentalism and NATO's operational needs.
It's definitely a complex integration, lots of moving parts. So as we kind of wrap this up, what are the main takeaways on Sweden's impact on NATO in the Arctic?
Okay, summing it up. Sweden joining NATO is a significant boost for the alliance's Arctic strategy. That's clear. Their location. Big strategic plus for deterrence. Their cold weather expertise massively improves NATO's ability to actually operate effectively up there. Their surveillance tech provides crucial awareness. And uniquely, they bring this strong environmental focus, nudging NATO towards more sustainable practices. So huge advantages, but also challenges in meshing military readiness with environmental protection in this really critical region.
That's a really great summary. And it does leave us with a final thought for you, the listener. When you think about Sweden trying to balance military power and environmental responsibility within NATO, what could that mean for security strategies in other sensitive regions facing similar pressures? How might other countries handle these competing demands, security versus environment going forward? Definitely something to mull over.
Indeed. And if you want to dig deeper, we encourage you to check out the kinds of sources we drew from for this deep dive and keep following the news on Arctic security and how NATO strategies are evolving there. Thanks for joining us.